The winter of 1931 came too early in Cincinnati. The factory chimneys released only thin, lazy threads of smoke, and the boilers that once roared now stood cold, as if they had lost the will to fight. The Great Depression had turned American cities into silent collections of jobless men, women standing in bread lines, and children who learned far too soon the meaning of hunger. Samuel Harris was 11 years old when he began selling used shoes. His father, once a worker in an iron foundry, had lost his job 2 years earlier, swallowed by the collapse that devoured banks, wages, and hope. The Harris family lived in a cramped back room behind a closed bakery. Rent paid with small repairs the father did, trading hammer blows for food. Shoes were all that remained of adult dignity. Samuel discovered that on a rainy day, when he saw a man take off his own shoes to exchange them for soup at a charity mission, there was something sacred in that act. Each pair carried a story, a distance traveled. And Samuel understood, with the innocence and urgency of the hungry, that he could give new purpose to what others threw away. In the mornings, Samuel combed through alleys and church doors, collecting forgotten, cracked, and dirty pears. In the afternoons, he cleaned them with scraps of cloth and homemade polish made from grease and charcoal. The boy didn't speak much. People in the neighborhood said he had a beautiful silence, the kind that holds thoughts too big for his age. At the end of the day, he set up a small wooden box on top of an old crate, and there, between nails and laces, his improvised stand was born. The shoes gleamed under the yellowish glow of the street lamps, and he called to the few passers-by with a shy voice. "Good shoes, sir. Cheap, sir." Some stopped, others looked away, but there was always someone who, out of need or pity, bought a pair. The profit was tiny: a few wrinkled coins, an old loaf of bread, sometimes an apple dropped from a vendor's basket. But every night, before sleeping, Samuel hid a single coin inside a small metal box beneath the floorboards. He told neither his father nor his mother the reason. His secret was simple and sacred. He wanted to buy a book. The neighborhood public school had closed for lack of funding. The teacher, Mrs. Margaret, had given Samuel her last notebook and said, "Don't stop learning, boy. A man can lose his job, his home, and his bread. But if he can read, he still has a path." Those words stayed nailed in the boy's mind like nails in wood, and that's why, even tired and with cracked hands, he polished shoes late into the night, saving every penny to buy what he called a whole book, new, with the smell of clean paper. On freezing nights, while his father slept beside a bottle of cheap whiskey and his mother sewed clothes for the neighbors, Samuel looked out the window and saw the moon reflected on the shoes he had lined up for the next day. It was the reflection of a dream, and he promised himself that one day he would walk in his own shining pair, bought with honest money, not to escape poverty, but to step on it with dignity. And it was on one of those nights that he heard, for the first time, the sound that would change everything: the rustle of turning pages. It came from the next room, where the pastor's daughter read aloud to her little brother. Those words, soft, alive, magical, slipped through the cold bricks and lit a fire in the boy's heart. For the first time, he tasted hope not as a distant dream, but as an urgent need. As urgent as bread itself. The winter of 1931 wrapped Cincinnati in a gray blanket of resignation. The cold was relentless, and the snow mixed with chimney soot, forming a dirty veil over the city. The streets, once full of hurried men and noisy children, had become silent corridors where hope dragged itself slowly. The Great Depression had taken everything: jobs, wages, hearts. Samuel Harris woke up every day before dawn. The room where he lived with his parents was cramped, with damp walls and windows that let the wind in without asking permission. His father coughed without rest, worn down by exhaustion and the cheap whiskey that served as comfort. His mother, always quiet, sewed clothes for neighbors in exchange for food. The rhythmic sound of the needle was the only sign that life still insisted on continuing inside those walls. Outside, the world also seemed stitched together by fragile threads. Men sat on stoops, watching trains go by, loaded with coal and opportunities that no longer belonged to them. Women in dark scarves waited in the lines of soup kitchens, their eyes hollow, as if they had already cried everything they could. Children sold newspapers, shined shoes, or simply wandered through corners in search of something that still resembled childhood. Among them was Samuel, carrying a wooden box tied with string, where he kept used shoes collected from alleys and church doors. He cleaned them with polish made from grease and charcoal, polishing each pair with the same care other boys reserved for their toys. It was his small business, his way of resisting the collapse. During his daily walks, he passed a small bookstore at the end of Main Street. The display glass was fogged, and the golden letters on the sign had faded with time. There, among dictionaries, Bibles, and forgotten novels, stood a navy blue volume. The title, embossed in gold, seemed to shine even beneath the dust. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Samuel always stopped for a moment, staring at that book as one looks through an open window into another world. The price, 60 cents, was written on a small yellowed piece of paper. It was an unthinkable amount. 60 cents could buy bread, soup, or coal. But to Samuel, it meant something greater. The chance to learn, to understand what lay beyond the factories and the cold streets. Every coin he earned from selling shoes was saved with almost sacred discipline. At night, when everyone slept, he would count his small treasure in silence and hide it again in a metal box beneath the floorboards. The sound of the coins dropping was the sound of a dream being built, cent by cent. Weeks dragged on, and winter showed its cruelest face. Work became scarce, people had less to spend, and the cold seemed to punish those who dared to rise early. Still, Samuel persisted. The book remained in the window, waiting, like a promise. Until one dawn, an accident changed everything. A makeshift oven exploded in the bakery behind which the Harris family lived. The fire spread through the wooden walls, and within minutes the place was a heap of embers. Covered in soot, Samuel helped carry buckets of water alongside neighbors, but nothing could be saved. When the sun rose, only ashes remained, and the bitter-sweet smell of smoke and despair. The house, the little food, the shoes, everything was gone. Only the metal box survived, hidden beneath the burnt boards. Samuel found it still warm, its edges darkened, but intact. Inside were 42 charred coins, not enough to buy the book, but enough to keep believing. That morning, the boy walked to the bookstore, his body weary and his face covered in ash. He stopped before the window. The book was still there, untouched by the tragedy around it. The glow of the golden letters seemed to mock the misery of the streets. But to Samuel, it was the opposite. That glow was a calling. He entered the small shop for the first time. The smell of paper, dust, and wood mixed with the faint warmth of a small stove. The air there felt different, lighter, almost pure. The bookseller watched him but said nothing. Samuel stood still for a few seconds, staring at the book on the shelf. When he took it in his hands, he felt the weight of something more than paper. It was destiny. The man behind the counter saw the look in the boy's eyes and understood. Samuel placed the burnt coins on the counter and left without saying a word. He returned to the street, holding the book against his chest, wrapped in his torn coat. At that moment, he was no longer a poor boy holding an object. He was someone who had bought, through pain and courage, the first piece of his future. As he walked back through the ruined neighborhood, the cold bit his skin, but the warmth of the book heated his body. For the first time, Samuel realized that knowledge had the power to rekindle what fire destroys. That night, sheltered in an empty room lent by a neighbor, he opened the book and began to read under the dim light of a candle. The wind still slipped through the cracks, and the walls still smelled of smoke. But for the first time, the silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like hope. The fire marked the beginning of a new chapter in Samuel Harris's life. After the ashes cooled, the family lost what little stability they still had. His father, weakened by illness and shame, began wandering the streets in search of work, finding only closed doors. His mother was taken in by a distant relative and spent her days between tears and sewing. Samuel, however, followed the path his heart pointed to: survival with purpose. The local Methodist church opened its doors to shelter children who had lost their homes. Samuel was one of the first to arrive. The place was simple, smelling of thin soup and damp clothes, but it had something he found nowhere else: a table, candlelight, and silence. There, among thin mattresses and makeshift benches, he began to read the book he had bought with what remained from the fire. The nights were long and cold. While the other children slept, he hid under the thin blanket and opened the volume carefully, afraid the wind would blow out the candle's flame. The yellowed pages revealed a world of journeys, rivers, and dreams. With every paragraph he read, Samuel felt the reality around him grow less harsh. The distant rumble of trains blended with the rhythm of the words forming inside him. During the day, the boy returned to the streets. He kept collecting old shoes, now with the same reverence with which he handled books. He cleaned, stitched, and polished them. His small hands, marked with grease, contrasted with the shine he gave each pair. The few coins he earned were just enough to keep hope alive. People began to recognize him. The thin boy who sold shoes always had in his eyes something others did not: a quiet calm, as if he knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. As the weeks passed, the book became part of his daily routine. Samuel read until he memorized entire passages. He began whispering new words to himself while he worked, training his tongue and their sounds. Reading started shaping his thoughts and sharpening his gaze. He began to notice details of the city that once escaped him: the tones of the sunset over the iron factories, the way smoke moved on cold mornings, the sound of leather being cut in the workshops. Reading taught him to observe, and observing taught him to understand. On the streets, food lines remained long. Factories still fired more than they hired, and the Depression followed its merciless course. Strong men knelt before misery. Women hid their tears under worn scarves, and newspapers spoke of numbers and banks as if they were people. But Samuel saw something different. Beneath the ruin, there was still movement, a murmur of resistance he felt every time someone bought a pair of shoes and said, "Thank you." One day, a man in a dark overcoat watched the boy selling his goods on the sidewalk. His eyes did not linger on the shoes, but on the book Samuel carried close to his chest. That image, a ragged boy holding a volume of literature, was itself a portrait of hope. Without realizing it, Samuel began to inspire others. His example spread by word of mouth among merchants and neighbors, a reminder that there was still beauty even in times of hunger. A few weeks later, a local bookseller called him in to help sweep the floor and organize the shelves. It was simple work, but honest. The boy began dividing his time between shoes and books. In that quiet space, surrounded by pages and dust, he found a new kind of shelter. The sound of turning pages replaced the clatter of hammer blows. The smell of paper took the place of street smoke. Samuel did not read just to escape misery, but to understand it, to see it as part of a greater story, one in which he, too, was an author. At night in the shelter, he began sharing what he read. The children gathered around, curious, as he recited passages from the book in a calm, steady, almost adult voice. Many didn't understand every word, but all of them felt something, a spark of hope no loaf of bread could offer. The shared reading transformed the shelter into a living space. For the first time, silence wasn't born of hunger, but of listening. Over time, Samuel earned a nickname among the other children, the Book Boy. The church pastor noticed the light in his eyes and allowed him to use the small library beside the altar. It was a modest room with few volumes, but to Samuel it was a cathedral. He began visiting it every day, sitting at a makeshift table lit by wax-dripped candles. He read everything he could: stories, old newspapers, atlases, encyclopedias. Each new page was a territory conquered. As his knowledge grew, so did his awareness of his own strength. Samuel began to understand the power of words, the logic of ideas, and the value of time. He discovered that a man may have nothing, but as long as he can read, he still has direction. When the shelter announced it would close due to lack of donations, Samuel felt the weight of loss once again. The children would be sent to different public institutions, and the fear of emptiness returned to haunt him. Still, reading had taught him something essential. Nothing is ever truly lost when you carry within you the will to begin again. In the days that followed, he found refuge among the books of the bookseller who had taken him in. He slept among boxes and stacks of paper, under the weak glow of a lamp, with the distant sound of streetcars slicing through the night. There, surrounded by stories from other worlds, Samuel realized that the city, too, had learned to read, not with its eyes, but with its heart. Because while everyone else struggled to survive, he read in silence for them. And with each page he turned, he made a promise that the future, uncertain as it was, could still be written. The summer of 1932 arrived quietly, as if afraid of being noticed. The streets of Cincinnati still carried the scent of old winter, and the city seemed to live between two seasons, the past that refused to leave and the future that had yet to be born. In the alleys, children played with crushed cans, and men waited for jobs that never came. Hope, when it appeared, came disguised, sometimes in a bowl of soup, sometimes in a piece of good news that soon proved false. Samuel Harris now lived in the back of the bookstore. The bookseller, moved by the boy's persistence, had allowed him to sleep among boxes of paper and old shelves. The space was small, but for Samuel it meant more than a home. It was the heart of a new world. Every morning he swept the wooden floor, cleaned the windows, and arranged the books with the precision of someone handling relics. Each cover had its own texture, each volume its own scent. He learned to recognize encyclopedias by their weight, novels by the worn edges, and old manuals by the color of their pages. The work was simple, yet within it lived a greater feeling, the sense of rebuilding, page by page, his own life. During the day, Samuel still sold shoes on the nearby streets, but now he did it not only out of necessity. His small trade had become an exercise in observation. He saw stories in every person who approached, faces carved by struggle, hands that carried too much work and too little rest. he began to realize that every pair of shoes told a journey. Some came from closed factories, others from men who had given up looking for work. Some belonged to women who walked miles to sell fruit in the markets. Samuel learned to see humanity even in worn leather. At dusk, he returned to the bookstore. The lights were dim, and the city's noise faded into a distant hum. He read whatever he could, copied passages onto scraps of paper, and sometimes simply watched as the shadows stretched across the shelves. Over time, he began helping the bookseller organize the collection by theme. Constant reading had given him a sense of order, patience, and curiosity. His fingers, stained with grease and paper, were no longer symbols of poverty, but of learning. One night, as the wind blew through the poorly sealed windows, Samuel felt something new stir inside him. He no longer read only for pleasure. He read to understand the suffering around him. He began writing small notes about what he saw on the streets: hunger, unemployment, the lost dignity of men. The words were simple but sincere. They were born from the same instinct that once made him gather broken shoes, the need to mend what was in ruins. Little by little, the fragments became short texts. Samuel copied sentences that inspired him and pasted them on the walls of the storage room where he slept. Quotes about courage, faith, perseverance. Those phrases became the foundation of his mind. When exhaustion overcame him, he read them again and found strength within the words. People began to notice the change. The boy who once only sold shoes now seemed different. He spoke clearly, held his gaze steady, and carried himself with quiet confidence. Some men came to him not just to buy, but to listen to his words of encouragement. Slowly, Samuel became something rare in those times, a silent symbol of hope. The bookseller watched his progress with quiet admiration. He allowed the boy to use a corner of the shop to teach reading to other neighborhood children. They were few, but they came with attentive eyes and dirty hands, bringing with them the same hunger to understand the world. Samuel improvised lessons using pages torn from newspapers and damaged books. He taught letters, syllables, and phrases, and every small victory of his students felt like his own. He realized that, in some way, knowledge could also be bread. As the city dragged itself under the weight of the crisis, that small reading group became a refuge. The children's laughter echoed between the shelves, breaking the silence that ruled the streets. The soft sound of their voices spelling out new words was, in itself, a form of resistance. Poverty was still there, firm, cold, relentless, but it no longer had the same power to destroy. The words were winning. Time passed, and Samuel began to dream of something greater. He wanted to open his own shop, a place where he could sell shoes and books side by side, objects that represented body and soul, labor and knowledge. He started saving coins again, this time in a different box, a polished wooden one. The metallic sound of his savings reminded him of the past, but their weight was different now. Once, each coin represented fear. Now, it meant purpose. With every step, Samuel moved farther from the boy who once sold shoes on the sidewalk. He was becoming a man shaped by reading, discipline, and compassion. And though he didn't yet know it, he was about to discover that knowledge, when shared, nourishes more deeply than bread. Autumn arrived carrying the scent of wet wood and burnt leaves. The golden light of late afternoons contrasted with the gray of the factories, where the few who still had jobs worked double for half the pay. Newspaper headlines spoke of slow improvements in the economy, but on the streets, recovery felt more like a promise than a fact. Samuel Harris was now known throughout much of the neighborhood. People saw him as the boy of books and shoes, someone who carried the weight of the world in his hands, but still walked with dignity. The children continued to attend the small improvised classes in the corner of the bookstore, and every new word learned was celebrated as a victory against forgetting. The bookseller, a man of few gestures and a calm voice, watched everything in silence. He knew the entire city was starving, not only for bread, but for meaning. And somehow, that thin boy with attentive eyes was feeding both. Nights in the bookstore had become rituals. Samuel read until his body gave in to exhaustion, surrounded by the distant sound of streetcars and the smell of aging paper. The cold returned, but it no longer frightened him. The fire that had once destroyed him now lived within, transformed into something that warmed instead of consumed. Over time, the shoes he repaired began to sell faster. Some customers left generous tips, impressed by the young man's posture and manners. Others, moved by his story, brought in extra pairs just to help. Samuel never accepted charity. Every cent he earned came from effort, and he guarded that principle with the same discipline he applied to his reading. It was during this period that he began to write regularly. His once scattered notes became organized reflections on what he saw in the streets, on what the crisis had done to people. He described the silent dignity of the unemployed, the soup lines, the hollow eyes of men who no longer believed in political promises. He wrote because he needed to understand, and understanding was his way of resisting. The filled pages began to pile up. The bookseller, noticing the habit, started keeping the young man's writings in a wooden box. He said that perhaps one day it would become a book. Samuel didn't reply, but he kept the thought like a secret. Meanwhile, the children grew, and many now knew how to read and write. Some started working in reopened factories. Others moved away with their families in search of new opportunities. Samuel saw in them the continuation of a cycle that, with effort, might one day be less cruel. But prosperity was still fragile. The neighborhood suffered occasional lootings and protests from hungry workers. Social tension grew as hunger spread. One day, the local government announced the closure of several charity institutions for lack of funds, among them, the one that provided food to the children who attended his classes. The news fell on Samuel like a sentence. He knew that many of those children ate only there. For days, he tried to find alternatives. He sought donations, sold extra pairs of shoes, and sacrificed part of his own meals. Still, it wasn't enough. On a particularly cold night, he made a decision that would change everything. He gathered the most valuable books from the shop, the ones that hadn't sold in years, and began selling them on the streets for symbolic prices. Some merchants called him crazy. Others, moved, bought them simply to help. With the money raised, he bought bread and milk and handed them out to those waiting outside the closed institution. The gesture spread through the neighborhood, and soon other merchants began to imitate it. The small, silent rebellion of a bookseller and a boy became the start of an improvised chain of solidarity. In that act, Samuel discovered the true cost of hope. Sacrificing what you love to save what can still bloom. The books he sold were like pieces of his own heart, but every fed smile made him understand that knowledge, when hoarded, is a luxury, and when shared, is power. The following week, the bookseller found the boy sitting on the shop's steps, watching the rain-soaked street. Samuel held only one book, the first he had ever bought, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The pages were yellowed, the edges worn, yet his eyes shone with the same light as years before. The boy who once sold shoes to buy books was now selling books to feed lives. And without realizing it, He had become the very symbol of the reconstruction his city had long been searching for. The winter of 1933 arrived wrapped in a heavy silence. The country was still trying to stand again, but the scars of the Great Depression were etched into every street, every face. The city breathed slowly, like someone learning to live again. The newspapers spoke of economic recovery, but on the sidewalks, misery remained the common language. Samuel Harris was now 17. His body had grown, but his gaze remained the same, steady, deep, carrying a kind of wisdom that came not from books, but from life itself. The bookstore where he worked had become a refuge for many. People came not only to buy, but to hear his calm, thoughtful words. The bookseller, now older and frail, watched the young man with the quiet pride of one who sees his legacy continue. Time had given Samuel something rare: respect. Not the kind imposed by strength, but the kind earned through constancy. The townspeople called him the young teacher. Older men sought his help to read letters, settle accounts, or make simple decisions. Children followed him through the streets, carrying small shoeboxes, imitating what he used to do when he was their age. But the past, like winter, always finds its way back. One morning, as he gathered books left at the shop's doorstep, Samuel noticed a hunched figure at the corner. It was a thin man, dressed in rags, his face covered by a thick beard, his eyes lost somewhere between nothingness and regret. It took Samuel a few seconds to recognize him. It was his father. Old Harris had disappeared years earlier, consumed by alcohol and shame. When he lost his job and his home, he lost his sense of belonging as well. Now he had returned, a ghost of the streets, frail, sick, invisible. His presence reopened the past like an old wound. Samuel remembered the nights when the sound of shouting and breaking bottles made him wish for silence. He remembered the fire, the cold, the helplessness. And above all, he remembered the boy who had sworn never to depend on anyone again. For days, the young man tried not to think about what he had seen, but his father's image haunted every corner, every tired face he met. The bookseller noticed Samuel's restlessness and understood without asking. Silence between them was enough. The following week, Samuel began leaving pieces of bread and small coins at the same spot where he had seen the man. He never approached him, never spoke. He simply let the gestures speak for him. It became a ritual of invisible reconciliation, a way to honor the past without letting it rule him. Over time, the old man began appearing more often, though he never came near the bookstore. He would sit across the street, watching the movement. Sometimes he seemed to look directly at his son, but quickly turned away, as if pride kept him from asking forgiveness. Samuel understood. He knew that some guilts cannot be erased with words. The weeks dragged on until the cold became unbearable. One morning, the old man did not appear. On the ground where he used to sit lay only a dirty blanket and an empty bottle. Samuel quietly asked around and learned that his father had been taken to the municipal shelter, weakened by pneumonia. That night, Samuel went there. The shelter smelled of medicine and despair. Among rows of beds, he found his father unconscious, breathing with difficulty. He stood there for a long time in silence, watching the man who, despite everything, had given him life. What he felt was a mix of pity and gratitude. Pity for what his father had become. Gratitude for what he had unknowingly taught him. That dignity is not inherited, but built. The old man died 3 days later. The burial was simple, with no flowers and no speeches. Samuel was the only one to see him to the end. He carried the coffin with his own hands, as if returning to his father the weight that the world had once taken from him. That gray afternoon, as he left the cemetery, the cold wind stung his face. But inside him, there was a strange peace. There was no anger, only acceptance. The ashes of the past had finally scattered. Back at the bookstore, Samuel lit the lamp and opened the book that had been with him since childhood. The worn pages looked even more fragile under the trembling light. He touched them gently, as one touches an old photograph. And then he understood. The true inheritance he carried did not come from blood, but from choices. The boy who once sold shoes to buy books had learned that forgiveness is the final stage of wisdom, and that no man becomes great while still bearing the weight of hatred. The year 1937 arrived with new breath for the nation. Factories roared again, trains crossed the cities once more, filled with workers and goods. Hope, which for so long had seemed dead, began to reappear in people's simplest gestures. In the smell of fresh bread coming from bakeries, in the sound of children returning to school, in the faint glow of shop windows lighting up at dusk. Cincinnati, now alive again, was itself a mirror of reconstruction. The streets still bore scars, but every new brick laid was a fragment of restored faith. Among the alleys and renovated buildings, a small storefront drew attention for its simplicity. A hand-painted wooden sign and a clean window display, humble yet full of history. It was Samuel Harris's shop. The place blended the scent of leather from new shoes with the soft perfume of worn book pages. On the shelves, neatly aligned pairs of shoes shared space with novels, encyclopedias, and old Bibles. It was an unlikely, almost poetic combination. The body and the mind side by side, sustenance and wisdom in the same room. Neighbors called it the shop of two worlds. The idea had been born from an old dream, to create a place where a worker could leave with new shoes, and a word to inspire him. Samuel believed that bread nourished the body, but knowledge nourished the whole man. And so, every customer who entered the shop found more than a product. There was attention, listening, and a rare kind of serenity in a world still rushing to recover. On the walls, newspaper clippings spoke of economic recovery, but Samuel preferred to decorate the space with handwritten quotes, thoughts he had collected over the years, reflections that had sustained him through the darkest times. At the center of the main wall, written in black ink on light wood, one phrase stood out. The man who learns to walk with dignity never walks alone. People read it, bought, talked. Some returned only to sit and rest. Others left small handwritten notes of gratitude. The place had become more than a store. It was a meeting point, a shelter for the weary soul of the city. The old bookseller was no longer there. He had passed away shortly before the grand opening, leaving Samuel the very space that had once been his bookstore. The young man kept the shelves, the counter, and even the iron lamp that had lit so many nights of reading. Every morning before opening the doors, Samuel lit that lamp, a symbolic gesture, a silent tribute to the man who had given him his first home. The work was hard. Samuel spent his days cleaning, selling, stitching soles, cataloging books, and attending to customers. But the physical fatigue was balanced by inner peace. Each pair of shoes sold represented someone's effort to rebuild. Each book carried the same hunger that had once driven him as a child, the thirst for knowledge. Little by little, the shop prospered. The income was enough to keep the business running and to sustain a small improvised school in the back room. At night, Samuel taught reading and writing to workers who, like him once, had been denied education. The sound of voices spelling new words filled the space, mingling with the creak of chairs and the rustle of pages. It was the same sound that had echoed years before in the church shelter, except now it was he who led. As the months passed, Samuel's name began to spread through the region, not as that of a merchant, but as that of a man who believed in rebuilding through knowledge. Some saw him as a symbol of perseverance. Others as a living reminder that the Great Depression hadn't just destroyed dreams, it had also revealed those capable of rebuilding them. On cold days, he still kept his old book close. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The worn and mended copy rested on the counter, wrapped in a fabric cover. Sometimes, when business slowed, Samuel opened its pages and read a passage in silence. It was like revisiting an old friend, the same one who had once guided him through the dark. At nightfall, before turning off the lights, he always performed the same ritual. He closed his eyes and gave thanks, not for profit nor for success, but for the journey itself, for the grease-stained hands, the books saved from the flames, and the faces that smiled upon learning a new word. Samuel Harris had finally learned that true wealth was not what one accumulates, but what multiplies when shared. And so, in that small shop smelling of leather and paper, the boy who had once sold shoes to buy books became, without realizing it, the man who sold books to rekindle souls.